Warm welcome to everybody, and it's amazing that we've reached this milestone of a centenary of happy hours. I think little did we think that when the pandemic hit us, that we would transform the way we sort of communicate through our digital platforms and lead to a variety of virtual events, and the happy hours have become an ever popular way of HousingLIN continuing its knowledge exchange and supporting the really important work of putting policy and research into practice and enabling all our members to continue their discovery of learning and improvement. This session focuses on the all-party parliamentary group report and the inquiry, and we're going to hear a lot about that this afternoon. But before I pass over to Richard Lord Best, who's the co-chair of the all-party parliamentary group on housing and care for older people, many thanks for everybody who's participated. I don't think there's anybody who's attended all 100 happy hours, but we have over 300 of you joining us virtually this afternoon, and a big thanks also to the UKRI and the Healthy Aging Challenge for supporting these programs too. So with the sponsorship and the advert over, I'm going to pass over to Richard. So Richard, many thanks for agreeing to chair this really important session.
Great. Jeremy, we begin with thanks to the HousingLIN, don't we? Because you've absolutely transformed the way in which we now can communicate all these wonderful reports that we produce. It was 2009 when the first HAPPI report came out, all that time ago, 15 years. So it's another birthday party today. But what happens with all these reports? They join a line of other reports on the shelf. For about 20 minutes, they're exciting. The Guardian does a half page if we're very lucky, and that's the end of that. No, not when you've got a HousingLIN that spreads the word, that has 100 webinars, fantastic, following through on these different reports that we've produced from the all-party parliamentary group. It is a fantastic resource. Jeremy, you know, you and your colleagues, you've really got to be congratulated. You've just transformed the way in which we can communicate the outcomes of people's hard work looking after these documents. Just in passing, I would say that the back numbers are pretty good and worth having a look at too. On the HousingLIN website, there's rural housing for an aging population, there's rental housing for an aging population, there's shared ownership housing. I like that one because shared ownership housing for an aging population was our so happy report. We were just so happy with that one. That was especially good one. But one after the other, these reports come out. Often the hard work has been done by the HousingLIN. Sometimes we've got other people to do it. But whichever it is, it then gets the treatment of being disseminated, spread far and wide by the HousingLIN, which is just magic. So great stuff, and happy 100th for that too. Special one today, the regeneration of outdated sheltered stock. Usually our reports are about new build. And indeed, the 2009 starter, the HAPPI report that started all this running, was very much about new build, about design, about quality, about high standards. And that's lasted the test of time and done really well. Jeremy thinks we should revise some of the ingredients in that. I'm sure we should. But that has led to the design awards, which each year have drawn attention to the whole HAPPI notion by focusing on brilliant new schemes up and down the country. This year won that famous award won by the Appleby Blue scheme in Southwark. This wonderful almshouse scheme, brand new, absolutely fantastic. If you get a chance to go and see it and you haven't done so, go and see Appleby Blue in Southwark, right within the heart of the community, beautifully built. Because they're an almshouse and don't obey any of the usual rules that govern the rest of us, they've gone to town, spent 25% more than the rest of us ever have on an extra, it's in effect an extra care scheme. The question is, and they're going to answer it, I think, very fully, was it worth spending another 25% to have a really fantastic scheme? The answer, I think, is you'll all agree if you go there, yes, it is. But they're going to research that and look at the savings that we make with the new build that we do in terms of housing for older people. A lovely example and one of many really great schemes that have come through the Happy Design Awards year after year. But this report, our latest from this long stream of new work, the latest one was on regeneration of outdated, sheltered, we put it sheltered in inverted commas sometimes, housing stock. It's about the existing stock, the 527,000 homes that are already out there, a lot of them from the 1960s and 70s, ghastly bed sits. No, don't tell me, oh, some people like being in a bed sit. Nobody can live in a bed sit 99% of their waking hours in one room. It's not good enough. We're absolutely ready for an update. There's a refresh needed for tens of thousands altogether of those sheltered housing schemes of yesteryear. And we now need to resource that and find the ways, first of all, of planning and understanding what we've already got, looking at our stock, and then of deciding what we're going to do next. And we're going to hear from a galaxy of stars who are participating in the good things that can happen if you take seriously the challenge to regenerate outdated shelter stock. So I won't detain us any further, and let's hear from the first practitioner who's part of the process of making things happen in terms of upgrading the stock that we've already got, and which Homes England and the government need to understand needs some serious resourcing again now. Claire Joise, Assistant Director of Care and Support Strategy at Metropolitan Thames Valley Housing Association. Claire, over to you.
Thank you very much. Just bear with me 1 second, just whilst I share my slides. Okay, can you do that? Right. Is that showing up on the screen?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Now.
Perfect. That's great.
Thank you. Okay. Yeah, so thank you, Richard, and hello, everyone. Thank you so much, really, to the HousingLIN for having me at the centenary party of the webinars. My name's Claire Joise. I'm Assistant Director of Care and Support Strategy at Metropolitan Thames Valley Housing. I'm here to talk to you about the work that we've been doing to understand the suitability of older people's housing and supported housing so that we can determine whether they're fit for the future, prioritise investment, but also identify those homes that may not meet those emerging quality standards. Just by way of context and background, Metropolitan Thames Valley is a relatively large housing association, member of the G15. It owns and manages 57,000 homes across 3 regions in the UK. Those are homes in London and the South East, the Midlands and East Anglia. The organisation has grown from its roots in the 50s when it was established to provide homes for Windrush migrants in London. And our core purpose is that everyone should have a home and the chance to live well. And our supported housing delivery is a key function in supporting people through the different life paths. And you'll see here our supported housing, which incorporates our housing for older people, makes up around 10% of our stock. Across our supported housing and later living accommodation, we operate around 5,800 homes. And you'll see that around 2,400 of those are supported housing units and around 3,400 are homes for older people. We work with over 40 care and support organisations that deliver services to individuals within our stock. And we are also delivering supported living services ourselves with specialist services for individuals with mental health support needs, learning disabilities, experience of homelessness and rough sleeping, as well as asylum seekers and refugees. And within our sizable older people's housing service area, we deliver an enhanced housing management offer. Around a year ago, our board signed off on an ambitious strategic plan that places our customers and service users at the heart of our supported housing offer. By focusing on key service areas, we're strengthening our expertise, aligning our service models to our role as a major housing association, And we feel that one of our strengths is our ability to support individuals through those different life stages, whether that's building the skills to maintain their own tenancy or settling comfortably into a home in their later years. And you'll see that one of our key objectives is to deliver supported housing that is fit for the future. But with a sizable stock of almost 6,000 units, determining where to place that investment and what that looks like needed us to have a methodology for reviewing that stock. The priority acknowledges that as a sector, some of the older people's housing and supported accommodation has experienced areas of underinvestment in the past, as well as having been developed or purchased several decades ago when models of care and support were different to what they are now. So we wanted to have a framework for reviewing our stock so that we could make strategic decisions about their future. Our first step has been to establish a set of criteria which was incorporated into the APPG document as a way of assessing our older people's and supported housing accommodation. The key element here is to measure these with the residents' need in mind, and I'll come on to the criteria in the next slide, but it's with the knowledge that our stock centred around whether it's provides suitable and high quality accommodation. With that information, we can direct investment, identify opportunities for development, and where necessary, converting some supported housing or later living stock to general needs accommodation or sale. The latter is quite tricky for us because we don't want to lose units, but we have to hold ourselves up to a high standard. And where accommodation doesn't meet that standard, we do have to take bold steps to reform the quality of accommodation. And so as we roll out our asset appraisals for our supported and later living stock, we're drawing out what works well, what our residents tell us they like and don't like about their accommodation in order to develop a quality and design specification for refurbishment and voids. As I say, there is a version of this within the APPG document if that size is not too visible, but my background is as an occupational therapist, and my special interest has always been inclusive design and accessible housing, and that's quite heavily influenced our approach to our asset review methodology. Historically, our asset review and asset management methodologies have focused on stock condition, sustainability standards, property value, and other financial metrics. But what I wanted to do was draw out the suitability of that accommodation for the end user. Essentially, does the property provide the right environment for a person with support needs to settle and thrive, or could it do so if we were to invest in that particular property? So I developed this framework as a way to consider suitability, allowing us to capture some of the elements that could determine suitability at a relatively high level. With a stock of 5,800 units, data collected allows for comparison and for us to prioritise certain properties for actions. By measuring the criteria separately in each of those criteria listed here, it allows us to set certain parameters for action. We can consider whether improvements could be generated through investment in key areas. So, for example, we may see long-term voids in some units and buildings that may need redecorating, and they may share bathrooms. However, our knowledge of the stock may lead us to conclude that the property is in a great desirable location, it's in an area of high need for the local authority, and it may well be suited to a customer group where it isn't for its current customer group. And so we have, through applying this methodology, begun converting buildings in great locations into schemes for specialist customer groups by introducing bathrooms and creating ensuite accommodation into otherwise dated property, and into schemes which were hard to let. And so with our older people's housing, we're able to review quality and suitability, particularly space standards and amenities, overlay that with data on refusals and voids to highlight the schemes that would most benefit from investment. It's important to reflect that much as the type of need is enormously variable in specialist and supported housing, so too is the need for housing, various housing options. So there is no one size fits all, albeit that there may be some universal principles. So as we roll out the asset review, we're already seeing some interesting findings. In our supported housing stock, much of our stock shares kitchens and bathrooms. And that doesn't necessarily make these properties unsuitable for supported housing. But if you layer this with the information around scheme size, perhaps with large numbers of people sharing bathrooms, it starts to focus a need for further review of certain properties over others. There are very few accessible homes. And this isn't dissimilar to the shortage of accessible housing in general needs stock, but it does highlight risks of individuals with multiple needs being further disadvantaged by their home environment. We're seeing opportunities for redevelopment and refurbishment, as well as the benefits that investment can bring to the environment. So we're now shaping our quality standards, identifying areas for good practice, hearing from residents about what they like and don't. And we're using this to inform the specification of our refurbishments and our new developments. Importantly, we're placing equal, if not higher, value on quality and suitability of stock to support residents' need, with the building-based metrics of condition, value, and performance that are more typically used in strategic asset management reviews. I just wanted to share a couple of examples, and these are supported housing schemes rather than older people's housing schemes, but they do illustrate the power and impact of refurbishment. The first is a refurbishment of a detached property in South London. It had previously provided accommodation for adults with mental health support needs, but it had become vacant after the service was discontinued. So we refurbished the building and created high quality environment for 9 young adults at risk of homelessness or with mental health support needs. Some of them are leaving care. And the top floor, which on the lower pictures is on the right-hand side, provides a space for therapeutic interventions with a visiting clinical psychologist. And actually, since that photo was taken, there's been some resident-led investment into technology for young people to create podcasts. And the second one is also refurbishment of a supported housing scheme in southwest London, which had become relatively dated. It did have guardians in it whilst we were trying to work out the future use of that building. It overlooks a beautiful park, so we were really keen to retain it in supported housing. But we worked with the local authority to identify a gap in their learning disabilities pathway for young people with learning disabilities, autism, or mental health support needs, living away from home for the first time or leaving residential colleges. So to the left is, on the bottom photos, is the communal lounge. The middle is the view from one of the bedrooms. And to the right is a sensory room that's also used for key working sessions. A marked difference from the before photos. So we're working through the asset review across our almost 6,000 homes, and our plan is to continue this rollout across our older people's housing and supported housing on a continuous cycle of gathering that data. We need the benchmarks for what good looks like, so developing those quality standards. We already have a design guide for older people's housing. These helpfully inform our plans for new developments and older people's housing regeneration. They do incorporate the HAPPI standards, and we worked with PRP architects to develop these. But we accept that new build standards are very difficult to achieve in existing buildings, and so quality standards for existing accommodation is equally as important as new build. The challenge comes with finding the capital funding through grants or otherwise to deliver a continuous programme of investment. These are really difficult financial times for the affordable housing sector, but what the asset review does allow us to do is prioritise, make decisions and target investment where we think it will have the best impact. Those are all of my slides, so I will stop sharing and I'll hand over to Joise Bishton from Orbit Group, Head of Support and Service Development.
Thank you, Claire. I'm just going to share my screen. Lovely,
Right.
thank you. So I'm going to talk about some of the transformational work we're doing around the customer and the building offer from the perspective of Orbit. Next slide, please. So just start by giving you a little bit of background about Orbit. We're a not-for-profit registered provider. We were formed in 1967 by two men sitting on a park bench contemplating how to tackle homelessness. We've got a portfolio of approximately 47,000 homes, and the geographical areas in which we operate are the Midlands, the East and the South of England. Our specialist housing that we offer provides homes for around 7,000 people. So within that 7,000, we've got age designated housing, so housing for over 55s without any care and support. We've then got independent living or sheltered housing, which has a scheme officer on site. Then we have extra care, which has 24-hour on-site care and support. And then we have a supported housing portfolio for working age adults. So that's just to give you a bit of background about Orbit. Next slide, please. So the needs of our ageing population are changing along with changing external factors. And we've looked at how to develop our service offer to improve the customer experience. We've found an evolution of customer demands and expectations, things like bigger space requirements. Somebody mentioned earlier about bed sits, they're no longer fit for purpose. We've got more couples and single males coming into our schemes, and we've got a more ethnic and diverse communities as well. We're also finding that our ageing population now brings more complex physical and mental health issues to deal with. The change in regulation and TSM scores mean that we have to know our customers better, and we need to be able to flex our services accordingly. And of course, we want to do the right thing for our customers and the communities that they live in. Next slide, please. So the case for change, I'm just going to read you an extract from our vision. So everybody should be entitled to a good quality home they can afford in a place they are proud to live. For us, this means providing good quality, affordable and safe homes, creating sustainable neighbourhoods that prioritise the well-being and aspiration of residents, and helping our customers to sustain their tenancies and provide them with access to services and support to help them improve their opportunities and navigate the challenges that may throw them off course. We need to provide wider health and wellbeing services to promote independence beyond the home. Most social landlords have seen a net loss of specialist stock over the past 5 years, with schemes reaching the end of their life, excessive voids, or becoming uneconomical to refurbish. We've also found that there's been little or no specialist offers for older people within our general needs stock. Next slide, please. So we want our customers to understand that there's a housing pathway. So at Orbit, we've got a large cohort of customers, of older customers in our general needs stock. We've then got designated housing for over 55s. We've got independent living with on-site scheme officers. And then we've got extra care with on-site care 24 hours a day. But our customers are confused by these options. They don't know what the names mean, and they don't know what the options are available to them. We want to be able to unlock this and help people to live as independently as possible for as long as possible in the setting that they choose. Next slide, please. So additional support services. So as I mentioned earlier, we haven't previously had a specialist offer for people that live in our general needs accommodation, that want to stay in their own homes. So we've revisited our home adaptations policy and procedure and our reasonable adjustments policy and procedure. And then we're linking this to our age well hubs that I'll talk about in a minute. We want to, the ethos is to link people to the right services at the right time for them. Next slide, please. So our age well hubs have just launched. We've just launched our first 2 as a pilot, and we're using our independent living schemes and our extra care schemes as hubs for delivery of services within our wider communities. We want to have an integrated approach to community health and adult social care. So for people living in our schemes and those nearby, this will help to reduce isolation, increase cost effectiveness, and increase the footfalls coming into our schemes. There'll be weekly sessions. Some of those will be an informal tea and talk type sessions, and some of them will be delivering wider wellbeing services such as falls prevention to help our customers to age well and remain independent for longer. We also want to bring the outside in to show people in our wider communities what it's like to live in our schemes. Next slide, please. So that's sort of what we're doing around our customer offer. But I just wanted to talk about refurbishment and generation. So our buildings are aging stock. We've identified schemes where the communal areas could be made more attractive. We've developed a scheme improvement programme where we're looking at lighting, signage, and we're linking this to our capital delivery programme to provide a refresh of our communal areas and furniture to bring the schemes up to date. We've also identified where we've got poor financially performing schemes, where there's opportunities to look at increasing unit numbers through unused communal spaces and extra land on the sites to add extra units. The benefits of this work are seen as increasing customer satisfaction, void reductions, and it's also helped to bring the outside in to promote that housing pathway. Next slide, please. So in summary, we're looking at different options to support older people, how they want to be supported, support to stay in their own homes, but with the age well hubs to access additional support, but also the awareness of the housing pathway that we have to show people the different stages of specialist accommodation that's available to them. Thank you. So I'll hand over to Adbul, who's the Head of Development and Relationships at Abbeyfield.
Thanks, Josie. Thanks, Josie. I've decided that Jerome will look after my slides because I've got enough to do with talking about what I'm going to talk about. So if you're ready, Jerome. So just while Jerome's getting the slides ready, a bit about me and a bit about Abbeyfield Society, or as Lord Best referred to, Abbeyfield Living Society is what we're calling ourselves now. So we were instrumental in supporting and sponsoring the APPG because we felt that there was a real challenge in terms of a lot of providers that we see in terms of our sort of wider Abbeyfield family who were struggling in terms of keeping tracks with their stock investment needs. And we felt that given the new build numbers generally, that we needed some attention. So that's why firstly I had to persuade my own organization that this is something that we should consider. And then it took a few goes with Lord Bess and the APPG to consider this. But I'm really pleased that the APPG took the challenge on and that we're here today discussing a very important part of that. So I can't compete with the numbers of units that my other colleagues have got. But what Abbeyfield is unique about is that we operate in 11 countries and 4 continents. So in a sense, you know, this is not just an issue facing here as in the UK and England, but a worldwide issue. Next slide. Big picture really is that we've got 11 million people who are aged 65 and over in the UK. and that will grow to around 22% of the population, and about 13 million in the next decade or so. So we know that also, as Josie said, the demographics of the aging population is changing, and it is a lot more diverse and a lot more health issues to consider alongside this. But clearly, addressing the nation's housing crisis cannot be done in isolation, and it certainly will require attention from all partners and stakeholders if we're going to make later living something that we're proud of, rather than look with despair. So how do we make older housing stock more desirable was the challenge that we had. So I want to briefly cover the following areas: why this is important for us in terms of our business and the sector at large, where we are in terms of what we considered as part of the APPG, and what we do next in terms of the sort of recommendation. And I think Lord Bess alluded to, in terms of, we don't want this report, or it's more importantly, its recommendations, to be collecting digital dust. Next step, please. Next slide, please. So we know already that older people have a range of housing options already, and I've taken this from a number of sources, but essentially what it does is that we know that the bulk of the population live in their own homes, and the challenge there is to future-proof that housing, so it can continue to serve people's need, and that they can remain independent as long as possible. But recently, we've seen that there's been move to enlarge the definition of disabled facilities grants, for example, to cover age, dementia, and this is starting to happen. But we also know that the DFG budget is under huge pressure. So to what extent we're going to be able to do that is problematic. That middle column and that middle hexagon is where sheltered housing sits. And we know that, looking at the characteristics of our residents, they are predominantly people who are on modest needs and who have been staying, in that sort of accommodation hitherto. But we also know, as we found through the APPG, that financial options to repurpose, regenerate, redevelop are small and few. So that's why we took the challenge on in terms of the APPG inquiry. And that last column is the new kids on the blocks, as I like to call them, the IRCs, the integrated retirement communities, who bring with them significant institutional investment from pension funds and other channels. And they predominantly, although there are exceptions to the rule, cover the top 20% of the economic ladder, and who, frankly, can afford their housing and care in older age. So I hope that was useful in terms of setting the scene. So next slide, please. So thinking specifically about the APPG, I think the structure of the whole APPG setup was really good. We had a panel of parliamentarians alongside sector experts who were there for the long haul. We had a number of meetings, and I'm sure Lois will go into that in a bit more detail. We had some specific work done by John Galvin and people at the EAC who looked at the numbers in terms of sheltered housing, and we got a sense of that. What we also did as part of the inquiry is gathered evidence and information and intelligence from a wide range of perspectives. So there was a call out for evidence. There were people who were invited to speak at the sessions on various topics, and they were from the whole spectrum of providers, as I listed in the previous slide. So I think what that's given us is a strong evidence base on which to assess what we're doing, come to the conclusion about what we need to do going forward, and actually reinforce that actually this asset that we've got needs to be preserved and protected, because once it's gone, it's gone. Next slide, please. But don't take my word for it. I've just highlighted some key people's comments on that. So, for example, from our point of view at Abbeyfield, my CEO talked about how this issue around the national asset is particularly particularly challenging for smaller organizations who are facing, you know, significant financial and asset management challenges, and who, without recourse to funding, would have to exit the market. And we've seen evidence of where, because of lack of financial options, they just could not make those schemes work, which is a tragedy. And in a sense, Abbeyfield is part of that. I think we invited Lord Best to come and visit one of our schemes in North London, in Muswell Hill. And I remember his first words, "What a lovely scheme." But we needed circa £800,000 spent on that scheme. And without recourse to that funding, unfortunately, we've had to take a painful decision. And Lord Best mentioned earlier about that, you know, many of the previous APPGs has focused on new build, increasing supply, and what have you. So I think focusing on the current assets that we've got was a departure, but I think something that we will have to focus on going forward. So hopefully that's actually generated a lot of interest amongst government and alike and the sector alike in relation to that. I think Jeremy kindly reminded us about, you know, how new technology, how the sort of construction process can all help and shape in terms of how we look at sheltered housing, how we repurpose, reset that for the next generation, because clearly we cannot afford to lose it, but we need to do something with it. Next slide, please. So what I've done here is, you know, the where question, and looked at some key characteristics that we identified within the supply side, and looked at some of the issues around choice and change, which go hand in hand. We know that the majority of the accommodation in sheltered housing is affordable, although much of the new stuff that is being built is very much from the private sector. We also know that the bill rates for new build is nothing like what we need. And I've got some slides hot off the press from Homes England, which I'll come on to. I know Lord Best at the launch event talked about the 7K figure, but that figure comes back to 2019. So I was determined for this session to get some more up-to-date data so we can sort of recalibrate in terms of what we've got. But also we know that doing nothing is not an option. And we know from the work that ESC has done that we're actually losing 2,000 homes per annum. And we've you know, that sort of scale means that we can't afford to wait until the next bidding round. We need to take action now, and this is something that we've been talking to the department and Homes England. But a lot of issues for providers. You know, a lot of them are forcing down the route that they have to sell the stock, and they cannot sustain it. The challenges around decarbonisation and reaching EPC is a real one. Unfortunately, Homes England's and the GLA's emphasis on additionality, that, you know, net additions has to be included, doesn't help. And we've been talking to them about taking a broader definition of additionality. I should also add, I think Homes England have been very pragmatic in terms of how they've allowed providers to use RCGF on a whole range of fire safety, energy efficiency works, which can help providers to retain stock rather than look for disposal options. But we also have to face some realities. Very few providers are looking at older person housing than, say, 10, 15 years ago, and that needs to change. And as we said, you know, the needs of residents and communities are changing. So the retention case, you would argue, it's strong, but is it reinforced in all the processes and funding and interactions amongst all the stakeholders? And always remember the people on their homes. That is the reason why we're here. Next slide, please. So I said to you about the figures. So we've been having a bit of tangle with Homes England through the Housing and Ageing Alliance and the NHF Older Persons Housing Group, which I sit on both of them, to try to get some sense of data and delivery in terms of the programme. So what you've got here is essentially two lines, the CME programme and the Strategic Partnership Programme. What you can see actually is the bulk of the older persons provision is being delivered through the CME routes. And there's very little coming forward from the strategic partnership, which actually sort of like has got access to bulk of the funding from Homes England. So that is an interesting one. You'll see that from the strategic line, there is nothing in older people and supported, and I've got some figures, that 666 figure. What we found is that there's no way of differentiating between older people and supported housing at the moment. So we're working with Homes England to improve upon that. What that shows is that, you know, the total rate is 5,790, and I've made a guess in terms of the ratios for the strategic partnership route. And when we hear the APPG talk about 30,000, the NHF talk about 38,000, the Professor Mayhew talks about 50,000, we are nowhere near that number, and that's not going to change soon. So the need to retain stock is paramount. Next slide, please. And what I've also done, and I won't dwell too much on it, is give you some regional breakdown. So you can see that the Northwest, there's something happening in the Northwest division where much more older person housing is happening. So we need to understand from those partners as to what they're doing and how they are working with the mayor, with all the other stakeholders in there to increase the delivery of new affordable housing. Next slide, please. So one of the things I think that the APPG report did really well is look at all the options and have case studies and examples that looked at regeneration, refurbishment, repurpose, and as well as disposal where there was no other options possible. I think there are some issues here around what you called sheltered housing, and we found 15 different ways in which we could do that. So one of the things I was talking to Jeremy about last week at the Housing 21 conference is that what should the next APPG inquiry be? And one of the issues around information and guidance, which I know the task force looked at in deep detail, is probably one that would help potential customers out there and communities out there to tailor and understand what's out there, because at the moment there's so much marketing and misinformation and complexity that we don't need to do that. I also wanted to touch the point around the demographics and the cultural diversity of that aging population and where it brings an opportunity for providers. And the best way I can show that is the next slide, which shows a heat map between the sort of living patterns from people from the host community and from some social minority communities. And what it shows is that for the host community, you know, the spectre of moving to a rural location or moving to the coastal area is a very strong one as we reach later living. But yet actually for many people from the Birmingham community, it's that concentration in urban areas. So providers, you know, who are struggling with voids, who are struggling with issues, there is a new market out there, and we need to think about how we open up that market to those groups of people, because you know the issues around lifestyle means that they're going to need care and support. Next slide, please.
Adbul, I'm sorry to interrupt you for a minute, but do you think you might be able to finish your presentation within the next couple of minutes?
Will do.
Fantastic.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
So the next slide really is just an overarching of the recommendations, and I know Lois is going to talk to that, but my point here is very simple. We're going to have to drive these recommendations to government, to providers, to local government. Otherwise, nothing's going to happen, and it will be another case of collecting digital dust. And my last slide, and I couldn't go without celebrating next last slide. As it's the 100th anniversary, next slide, please. As it's the next, one after that. As it's the celebration of 100th anniversary, I had to put cricketing first. So this is my donation to HousingLIN for reaching 100. Thank you. And I'll pass over now to Louis Beech, who's the consultancy and partnership manager at HousingLIN.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Adbul.
Abdul. I don't have a picture of me playing cricket, and unfortunately I don't have any slides either, so I was just going to talk to you about kind of our reflections, I guess, on the APPG inquiry. So we've obviously privileged to kind of act as a secretariat to the inquiry. So you've kind of seen what's possible in some of the earlier presentations, as well as some of the challenges. So I just wanted to highlight sort of three key things that I think are urgently needed from the sector, which draws on much of the recommendations in our report. And those recommendations can be found right at the beginning of our report. So the first is around kind of stock and asset management, and the quality and state of housing is already under the spotlight generally in the social housing sector, following the Grenfell inquiry as well as Arab's law. But this is not just relevant to sort of mainstream social housing, but also specialist housing too. And the inquiry panel, we sort of debated over how we should define outdated sheltered housing when there isn't really a nationally held data set on sort of quality and accessibility of sheltered housing schemes. So we landed on a date which was homes built before 1990 as a bit of a guide for outdated, which would effectively make me outdated. But this obviously doesn't take into account of things like refurbishments. But using that as a kind of cut-off date indicates that 73% of sheltered housing is built before 1990. So we might consider that to be outdated. So as we learned from the inquiry, sheltered and retirement housing providers, it's not just about kind of social housing providers, but also private housing providers need to review their existing stock beyond just sort of repairs and maintenance. It's about creating homes that are HAPPI compliant as far as possible. Housing providers need to undertake stock condition surveys and options appraisals, and the inquiry actually came up with a new charter for disposals that aims to retain sheltered housing as an asset as much as possible. I know there's a question about that in the Q&A box. The second thing is kind of key takeaway was about the sort of service model. So kind of what we've agreed is a sort of national understanding of what a contemporary service model looks like in sheltered housing. So based on the recommendations of the report, that's about a balance between sort of technology and on-site staff presence. The evidence suggested from what we heard that the majority of people would prefer to have a scheme manager available in sort of working hours. In some cases, people want more of that, but also around this sort of term that gets thrown around quite a lot. So culturally competent. So service models that meet the diverse needs of older residents as well. And I guess the other thing to sort of tackle, and what we sort of try to tackle in the inquiry and in our recommendations, is sort of how we use technology to support independence as well in existing, but also I guess new sheltered housing. The third, I guess, key takeaway was around understanding the local sort of housing market. So really trying to get under the grips of what do people want. Sheltered housing's a really prized asset with we've already heard figures at 527,000 homes. However, as we've already said, much of this is built in the last century. It doesn't meet the expectations of what our local housing market might want. So at a strategic level, local authorities really have a key role to play in understanding the supply and demand of this precious resource. And we've got recommendations specifically for local authorities in terms of sort of keeping track of existing supply and linking in with the kind of Support Housing Regulatory Oversight Act, of which some sheltered housing will come under, in terms of monitoring quality and supply. But of course, all of this was kind of underpinned by the sort of funding gap. So lots of the examples we saw in the inquiry were sort of funded through their own sort of funds, I guess. And our recommendations effectively call on greater financial support from government. We can see all the kind of specifically targeted recommendations for kind of funding towards HousingLIN, GLA in the report. And lastly, just to say at HousingLIN, the really great things, we're looking forward to putting our learning from APPG into practice. So not only in the sort of sharing network setting that we have now, but also through our research and advisory services. And we've been supporting a wide range of housing providers to consider the future of their sheltered housing, particularly focusing on the need to diversify the offer for a broad range of tenants, as well as creating kind of happy homes that are both attractive aspirational, and in many cases can support people to move before they need it and encourage people to move before they need it. Our work also spans to the local authorities as well, where we often undertake some of that work around kind of need and demand specialist housing, and we really look forward to applying our learning from the APPG there too. Because, you know, just the last thing to say is at the HousingLIN, we're really keen to see sheltered housing retained. So please do get in touch if you wish to discuss any of that further with us. I think I'm handing back over to Jeremy just to go through the video with you.
Lois, thanks very much, and thanks all the speakers. And I'm just a short interlude before I pass over to Richard to chair the Q&A session. But coming out of the APPG Inquiry report, points, and Adbul touched on this, and Lord Best as well, about information advice and how to raise awareness around sheltered housing. Very much it came through very strongly. Both, and Josie talked about the terminology as well. And while I'm very keen on the design of HAPPI and looking 15 years on, you know, information advice is also very close to our heart. So in anticipation of today, and we're giving you a sneak preview of an animation we're working on to really capture how sheltered housing has developed through the eyes of two young girls over the years, over 60 years, and every decade explore what sheltered housing means in relation to their grandparents, in relation to their parents when they move, and their own expectations and aspirations. I'm afraid we don't have the narration with you today or the music, but this just gives you a taster of how sheltered housing has evolved, and trying to make it much more accessible to make sure people, through the lived experiences and personal stories of the people who've contributed to this animation, we can demonstrate over a timeline of 60 years how sheltered housing has evolved, has adapted, but also looking forward, how the points around technology, climate change, a number of other features that we've discussed this afternoon around sustainable development. Sheltered housing is an anchor in many of our communities, and can continue to be that age well hub, Josie. I like that. So this just gives you a taster of what we're due to launch next month, and I hope you like it, and you will like the resulting animation, which we hope you can also share amongst your communities, local networks, and of course older people's groups too. So that's just a little bit from me, and I'm going to hand back to Lord Best, Richard, to now chair the final session and the Q&A debate. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. And so we come to questions and the Q&A boxes at the bottom of your screen. I'm just picking out, if I may, one or two things that seem to be repeated by several people, some anxieties that people are sharing with us. The top of the list, I think, is revenue funding, because we talk about all the costs of refurbishment, we talk about the cost of new build, but in this context, we talk about getting the outdated sheltered housing up to scratch. But there's the ongoing revenue costs, and the costs indeed that fall to the occupiers, additional service charges, higher rents. We used to have supported people grants, and those have mysteriously evaporated over the years. How do people in the front line here, Josie, Claire, Abdul, how are you feeling about the revenue side, the ongoing cost? Because otherwise your finance people say, oh, we'd love to do more of this, but unfortunately nobody gives us the revenue support. Local authorities haven't got any money. Sheltered housing is, if we can get rid of it, we'll get rid of it. So can we find the ways of including the revenue element in the solutions to our problems, or is this a real no-no for us?
I think from a housing management point of view, and the service chargeable elements of revenue funding, that is becoming increasingly difficult for us to really see what the long-term future of that funding is going to look like. Both that and the type of rent charges that we're able to charge on sheltered housing is a real risk to our viabilities. We find that affordable housing products, particularly in city areas, are really difficult to make viable when the rent settlements may restrict the rising costs and our ability to fund some of those service charges. So I think it is a challenge. I think much like a lot of housing products, it's really about having those long-term settlements with government around housing benefit eligible service charges, but also around rent. I think a recognition that affordable housing is a difficult tenure type to have in older people's and supported housing because of the dependency on service chargeable services. I think in terms of our supported housing, and if that any of those revenue conversations relate to the social care funded support charges, we always have actually seen a difficulty with local authorities having that long-term projection of revenue funding that will allow that strategic planning for builds and longer-term developments. However, saying that, if we've got a good housing, flexible, supported and later living housing product, there is certainly a need for it in the right areas. So if we build flexibly, I think we can weather the storms of different funding arrangements in order to be able to deliver it. But it does make our boards and our investment panels anxious that we cannot commit more than sort of 3 to 5 years worth of revenue funding. From our point of view, what that means is we need our landlord function to stack up independently of the revenue funding from a care and support contract point of view, because we cannot guarantee that there will be a commissioned service at the end of it.
Many thanks, Claire. That was more problems than solutions, but you managed to manoeuvre through the. Josie, how's it?
Yeah. I think just to add on to that, where we've it's not necessarily linked to revenue, but where we've done regeneration of our communal areas, things like that, because the affordability of service charges is a big issue for customers. We haven't put that onto service charge. We have chosen to fund that ourselves through a combination of some works that we've taken from our reserves, and then looked at our capital programme and sort of tried to marry that up to look at a 5-year programme, but we haven't gone down the route of adding that onto service charge at this moment in time.
Generously, I think, you know, the trouble is, if we're saying this is an expensive option, that refurbishment leads to revenue problems, it doesn't help. But, you know, that's the reality. It just, this is another irritant in the works. Abdul, at Abbeyfield, you faced.
I mean, we have been in the thick of this for the last 2 years. We've had to consult on significant number of our schemes where we cannot simply reconcile all the cost pressures against all the asset requirements of that stock going forward. And there's a limit as to what we can add or reclaim through the rent. I think the bigger challenge here is that during the APPG, we had a very interesting session with government and its departments, and where things like revenue funding to compensate and support new build of new stock was on the table, and I was very surprised at the sort of comments from officers from the department on that. Obviously, we have a new government now, and we need to see what's going to happen post the budget and assessment. It seems to me that the whole world's waiting for this budget and autumn statement. I wish it could come sooner, because we need some certainty in terms of what we're going. The difficulty, I think, here is that for boards of housing associations, they are nervous about making strong investment decisions in areas where the revenue support is precarious or could change in a few years' time. And that uncertainty, unfortunately, doesn't help increase the supply. And equally, that means that we're gonna have more problems like this. So in a roundabout way, the need to protect what we've got is absolutely critical.
Yeah. I think we have to look too to the Housing 21 anchor big players who can't cross-subsidize from their general family stuff, because they haven't got any general family stuff. They are the specialist bodies. And if they can make things work, then they're showing the rest of us, I think, some of the tricks of the trade that keep the revenue flowing. Let's move to another question. And just in passing, sadly, we didn't get any examples from Scotland. We were confined to England on this occasion, but the Scots usually have got something at least as good as anything we can show in England. So we need to embrace them too. Homes England, and here we are not in Scotland but in England. Homes England. People ask about the change in policy as we've had this additionality rule. You can spend some more capital if there's going to be more homes at the end than you started with, a redevelopment, a major refurbishment, as long as there's more homes. But that doesn't always work. That isn't always the answer. We need to just simply replace what we've got sometimes, and indeed sometimes lose a few units, but get an awful lot better product at the end of it. And the question is, has Homes England learned the hard way? Has it changed its policy on this? And I think the answer is that is on the way. That is a change of heart. It is part of the whole emphasis on existing stock rather than new, which is, the Social Housing Regulation Act, people feeling the Ombudsman and everyone else breathing down their collars. We need higher standards. We don't want any more of those ghastly incidents with mold and cold. But that is the pressure of today. And I think Homes England feel that pressure in the same way that the actual providers do. You guys are on the front line. But anyone got any comments that indicate that Homes England is reforming its ways and doing better?
So I can start on this. So we have sat down with Homes England and the Department of Health and Social Care and the GLA in this picture as well regarding this, because at the moment you do have to commend Homes England in some aspects of what they're doing around the whole notion of regeneration, around allowing people to use their RCGF on fire safety work, on energy efficiency work, which is actually enabling people like us in Abbeyfield to do vital investment work using that resource. The crux is going to be when we come to the next program and whether, as we recommended in the report, that a third of all the funding that is earmarked for older person can be retained for providers, particularly smaller ones, to do the improvement works on the existing stock. So I think that's the common effort that we all need, and that if that is secured within the program, we would have done well with this report, because at the moment that still isn't the case, unfortunately.
I agree, and I think as an additional point, really, there's an element around us being able to evidence the better performance of regenerated stock in fewer voids, increased accessibility of accommodation, and the impacts that has on independence, because measuring unit numbers on their own is not enough. We need to be saying what is a good quality environment and what delivers outcomes, and we see quite high levels of voids within our sheltered housing stock, because it isn't a model that people want to live in, especially the historical bed sits that so we will see a reduction in unit numbers, but the offset of that is a hugely increased quality of product, fewer voids, increased discharges from hospital straight into accommodation that is better suited to those individual needs. And I think it's really about shifting the narrative away from unit numbers.
Very important, though, for you general family providers, that of course when somebody moves into an existing or even a brand new retirement accommodation for older people, later living scheme, they vacate a family home, one of your family homes, and that's just gold dust. That's a social rented family home, just what everybody wants. Mm-hmm. So it is the 2 for 1. It's worth remembering it isn't just that older person having a better lifestyle. It's the fact that the move is possible if we keep the older stock up to scratch. Yeah. Can I just try a question on Lois? You were saying we need to be thinking more about the use of tech, and I know that the HousingLIN has been doing incredibly good work in getting us all up to speed on what kind of advances the whole tech scene has now brought to retirement housing.
Yeah, so that's absolutely fine. So I guess as a sort of sister to the HAPPI principles, HousingLIN, along with TSA, Technology Service Association, have come up with the HAPPI principles, which effectively are looking at sort of technology for an aging population, panel for innovation, and they are essentially a sort of a guide, if you like, in terms of when you're thinking about sort of, you know, what type of technology should be integrated into the home, to sort of start with some of those sort of guiding principles from HAPPI. So that the first two are really around kind of in co-production and connectivity. So crucially, I guess that it's that co-production element is understanding from residents and local people effectively what they want from their technology. So the HAPPI principles, I guess they went hand in hand with a sort of program, which saw sort of 6, I think it was, sites receive some funding from the Dunham Medical Trust to effectively trial and test different types of technologies within different housing settings. And each one would have kind of come up with sort of something different for their local residents. So I guess it's probably around kind of not just a sort of one size fits all in terms of technology. Obviously, there's sort of like, I guess, different levels of, you know, how far you sort of want to take it. Obviously, there's the kind of obvious link between Housing 21 and Apello, who've partnered to sort of deliver a digital ready system across their sheltered and extra care schemes, or retirement living, I should say, and extra care housing. So that's really a kind of a digital version, I guess, of sort of like a what we might call a traditional telecare program. But then we've got other providers like, for example, Clarion are in the process of handing out kind of mainstream technologies to their residents in what they call their Live Smart scheme. So a trial of seeing how can, you know, Lenovo tablets, I think it's Google Hub Nest, support their residents in terms of sort of social isolation and loneliness. So I think there's a whole kind of suite of different options out there available to people, but those kind of core HAPPI principles at the outset in terms of starting that conversation about what people might want, I think are a good starting point.
Right. Richard, if I could quickly come in, what's interesting, the parallels with the this inquiry report dovetails neatly with the growth of where we come from 60 years ago around social alarms and community alarms. The whole new debate around telecare, the Internet of Things, and potentially in future AI as well, I think will transform. But the challenge is how to keep residents engaged with that and involved right at the outset, but also to tackle the issues that Claire and Joise and Adbul have highlighted, make it affordable as well as sustainable so we can invest in these changes. And I know they're also trying to test some of these out.
There'll be lots more from the HousingLIN on the whole TAPPI scene, the technology for an aging population. Great stuff. Just one last one. I know we're running out of time here. The name sheltered housing. Oh dear, this is a hardy perennial. I think we had 15 different varieties of name, but later living did quite well. Independent living certainly did well. We're desperately trying to avoid using the phrase sheltered housing, aren't we? Nobody wants to live in sheltered housing. When I became chair of Hanover, I had my first meeting with the Residents' Council. And I said, so what's top of your request list? And they said, stop talking about sheltered housing. We don't want to live in sheltered housing. Oh dear. So we definitely need a word or a couple of words that we all agree on. And that's a mission for the HousingLIN. Jeremy, I'm going to hand back to you for final words.
Well, Richard, thank you very much for chairing today's session. It's been really illuminating, both hearing from you and Lois around the details of the report, but also the interpretations, the applications in particular by Adbul, Claire and Joise, and what it really means in terms of making sure there's a viable business on the one hand, but also delivering those health and social care outcomes and improved housing conditions to residents as well. And I think that sort of combination of housing, health and social care, that integration piece is really big. Can I thank all the speakers for your wonderful contributions. As Sally highlighted right at the outset, the slides, the recording, and the chat will be on our website shortly. I apologise that we weren't able to get through all the questions, some fantastic questions from colleagues from Wales, England, not so much Scotland, but I think there's some reference to Scotland. But if you are interested in this area, please do join us in future happy hours. Next week, we'll be looking at some of the work that Abbeyfield Development Corporation have done to look at new towns and looking at that urban living, something that Claire touched on in her presentation. And we'll also be joined by a Canadian company that is creating something called Happy Cities. Now, how can we have happy homes and happy cities? So again, that part of that agenda of how we're going to look at development of 1.5 million new homes in the UK, we need to think about how we make sure those are age-friendly and enable people to right-size or age in place. But without further ado, can I thank you all for participating? Can I thank the HousingLIN behind the scenes for reaching this milestone? And I look forward to welcoming you at a future HousingLIN happy hour. Thanks everybody for your time, and I hope you can go off and celebrate appropriately this evening.
We will. Thank you, Jeremy.
Bye, thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Jerome. Thanks, Sally.